Welcome to eSports Hero Café, where we talk about any and all esports. I'm your host, Bowman Shota, and today I have a very special guest with Roger Quiles. Did I say that right, Roger? I apologize.
Yes, you did. Thanks for having me on.
All right, glad to have you on. How you doing today?
Doing well, doing well. Enjoying spring finally in New York.
Nice, yeah. Yeah, we're enjoying that 70-degree weather here as well in Indiana, so... Now today we're going to be talking about contracts and kind of diving into the details and the controversy that's involved with it in esports currently. And you are a lawyer who specializes recently in esports, not just from player contracts but from the business side of it. But tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of how you got into esports.
Sure. So my background is I've always been a gamer my entire life. Went to law school straight from college and wanted to get involved in the sports industry, specifically in baseball. And did a lot of networking, a lot of hustling to try and break into that, and just never panned out with that regard straight up school. Worked for a judge, worked for a commercial litigation firm in Manhattan, and then decided to start my own practice where I was working for businesses as well as athletes. And in doing so, about 6 months or so after I started that practice, which is almost 2 years old now,
Yes.
next month actually, and about 6 months after that, I had come across at the time, I was very well aware of the esports industry, although I guess my knowledge on it was a bit dated at the time. And my assumption then was that it was still very much located in Asia, centered around things like StarCraft and so on. So I'd never been really a esports consumer thus far. And then I had an article come across one of my social media timelines discussing how a player was essentially being shafted by his team. And in that, the light bulbs just started going off, and started seeing all of the direct parallels to what had transpired in the professional sports industry early on in its livelihood. So specifically, probably around like 5 to 10 years pre-unionization, and it just made me think. I was like, all right, well, if this is growing this quickly, then who's representing these people, and who's helping these players who obviously always have the short end of the stick with respect to negotiating power. Who's representing the teams? How are these leagues organized? So that was the diving down the rabbit hole moment. And needless to say, from there, did a lot of networking, did a lot of my own research, my own investigation. That networking led to a client. That client led to 5, and then needless to say, about a year and a half later, it's now it's certainly my biggest practice area. It's probably about 95% of the work that I do.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So always chase those rabbit holes. But it's a lot of fun, and it's something I enjoy. And especially, it merges my own interests in the gaming side of things with the professional interests that I have with respect to the law stuff. So, working for esports orgs is really no different than working for a startup or a small business. They have a lot of the same issues. They have some different issues as well. Mm-hmm. And then working with the players is not really that different than working with athletes. A lot of the same issues present themselves, a lot of the same power dynamics, certainly some esports spin on things, but I guess it was just pretty fortuitous in a way that I had already aligned myself perfectly to do this esports work without even knowing it.
Nice.
But yeah, so that's how I've gotten to where I am.
Nice. And I saw on your website you work with contracts, but also you do like sponsor acquisition, branding, business management, and even post-career planning, which is exciting because actually my video next week, I'm going to be talking with a guy about that post-career planning and the non-gaming aspects. But like, as far as a player contract goes, like what are some of the the basic features that should be in a player's contract?
Well, first and foremost, one of the most important things that I'm going to look for is whether they're an independent contractor or an employee.
Hmm.
And this is an incredibly important distinction that the industry itself has kind of adopted this standard of independent contractor, which may or may not be appropriate depending upon the obligations that the player specifically is going to have. And the legal distinction of the two is, independent contractors have to pay their own taxes. They have to pay their own benefits, and so on. Whereas if you're an employee, your employer actually has to withhold taxes, has to provide certain benefits, has to provide has some liability over your actions, and so on as well. So that's the first thing I'm looking for. Most are independent contractor agreements. Some a very small amount, but a growing amount, are employee agreements. Beyond that, I want to know the terms of compensation, because certainly that's always has been a hot button issue in esports,
Yeah.
and certainly will continue to be, because it's very difficult when you don't have a highly regulated field to hide money or to prove that you actually have the money you say you have.
Hmm.
So compensation's always a concern of mine. What do those terms look like? What percentage of winnings are they getting? What's their monthly salary? Do they have a monthly salary? Do they get any percentage of revenue derived from merchandise bearing their name?
Hmm.
All these sorts of things. A lot of image protection. Then also, you want to look at, if you want to be super protective, and especially like if you have a very well-known, very good, talented player, you want to look at things like, well, do they get a percentage of any sale of the slot that they're in, if the particular game even allows for slot sales? Because certainly if that slot was earned while the player was there and participating on the team, then one can make an argument that that player should get a percentage of that.
Hmm.
So there's so many different things that go into these player contracts. Also, specifically, and something that's incredibly important to me is the terms of termination.
Oh,
And
yeah.
it's important for a lot of ways that people may not realize, because it's not just about teams are always going to protect themselves to the fullest extent, where they're going to try and make it as easy for them to terminate as possible. Some will not grant the players any sort of rights with respect to termination. Some will. Certainly, I've seen some teams, and even with the work that I do with teams, something I encourage is in an instance of non-payment. Excuse me. In an instance of non-payment or underpayment, essentially like creating a notice period where a player can tell the team, hey, you shorted me this month, or hey, you didn't pay me this month at all. Where's my money? And then that triggering, its own notice period of however many days. And if the team doesn't make good on that amount, however much it may be in that time frame, then that the player could request their own release. That would be immediately granted. But other things that are probably a little more nuanced that people that aren't attorneys may not think of is, well, what are these contracts going to be immediately terminated if, let's say, you have a challenger team that's relegated out of challenger,
Oh.
or are they bound to a team that is no longer competing at that level, or if they're competing at all? So I had a situation where I had to try and get a player out of a contract with a organization who released everyone except that one player. So they can get very, very messy. And essentially, the way you want to approach, or the way I approach, these contract negotiations is looking at it from a worst case scenario, because certainly you want to avoid all of the potential pitfalls that we've already seen esports have, like with respect to termination issues, non-payment issues, and some other problems as well, and image usage. Image usage is incredibly important, and certainly a player wants to retain as much control over the use of his image as possible, which may mean things like the team not being able to merchandise the player's likeness after they've already gone from the team. after the contract's terminated, and so on. So it's you want to be very, very protective. Obviously, the team also wants to be very protective, so there may have to be some of that. You may have to find some of that middle ground, but but you also want to be a little forward thinking, and saying, well, all right, well, we know this team hasn't had problems with this before, but you never know, and certainly the lifespan of a player could come and go much quicker than it could for a team.